The ceasefire lasted 14 days of fragile quiet, 14 days of cautious optimism, 14 days during which diplomats exhaled, markets stabilized, and families in conflict zones dared to sleep without listening for sirens. And then it was over. In the span of a single overnight window, the agreement that world leaders had hailed as a turning point collapsed, not with a gradual unraveling, not with quiet diplomatic failure behind closed doors, but with a sudden, unmistakable breakdown, the kind that sends emergency signals racing through intelligence channels, scrambles military command centers, and forces heads of state out of bed at 3 a.m. The world woke up this morning to a situation more dangerous than the one it thought it had left behind. Here is what we know. A 2-week ceasefire brokered through intensive back-channel negotiations involving multiple world powers has officially collapsed. The agreement, which had paused one of the most volatile active conflicts on the planet, was declared void after a series of alleged violations that each side is now blaming on the other. Within hours of the breakdown, military movements were reported, weapons systems were repositioned, rhetoric from senior officials escalated from cautious to incendiary, and in the war rooms and foreign ministries of Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, and beyond, the question being asked in hushed, urgent tones is the same one that now hangs over every headline. Is this how larger wars begin? This is not speculation. This is not fear-mongering. The historical record is unambiguous. Some of the most catastrophic military escalations in modern history began not with a declaration of intent, but with exactly this kind of moment: a ceasefire, a violation, a blame cycle, and then a chain reaction that no one could stop. What makes this collapse uniquely dangerous is the architecture of the conflict itself. This is not a contained regional dispute between two isolated actors. The parties involved in the ceasefire are directly or indirectly tied to the strategic interests of nuclear-armed powers. The geography of this conflict sits at the intersection of critical energy corridors, military choke points, and alliance commitments that stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. When this ceasefire held, it held the line on something much larger than itself. Now that it has failed, that line is gone. In the sections that follow, we are going to take this apart systematically. We will trace how this conflict reached the point of ceasefire. We will examine exactly what happened in the hours before and after the collapse. We will hear from military analysts, intelligence assessors, and geopolitical strategists about what this breakdown signals. And we will follow the consequences economically, militarily, and diplomatically all the way to their potential endpoints. Because what happens in the next 72 hours may determine whether this remains a regional crisis or becomes something far worse. If you are watching this and you want to stay ahead of this story as it develops, subscribe now, hit the notification bell. This situation is moving fast, and we will be here every step of the way. Stay with us to understand why the ceasefire collapsed and why its collapse carries the weight that it does. You have to go back, not just weeks, not just months. You have to go back to the foundational tensions that made this conflict inevitable long before the first shot was ever fired. Because this war did not begin with a violation. It did not begin with a military order or a political miscalculation. It began with decades of unresolved grievances, competing territorial claims, and the slow, methodical failure of every diplomatic framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this outcome. For years, in some cases for generations, the parties at the center of this conflict operated under an uneasy and deeply unstable status quo. Borders drawn by colonial powers or post-war treaties never reflected the ethnic, religious, or political realities on the ground. Resource competition over land, water, energy infrastructure, and strategic access routes created permanent pressure points that periodic diplomatic agreements managed but never resolved. External powers recognized the strategic value of this region early. Military aid flowed in, intelligence partnerships were established, proxy relationships were built, sometimes openly, sometimes through layers of deniable intermediaries. Each major power that inserted itself into this equation did so with its own calculus, its own red lines, and its own definition of an acceptable outcome. The result was a conflict ecosystem primed for explosion. The sequence of events that led directly to the ceasefire followed a pattern that analysts had been warning about for years. In the opening phase, localized skirmishes, the kind that had occurred dozens of times before without triggering full-scale conflict, suddenly produced casualties at a scale that neither side could politically absorb without a response. Command structures that had previously exercised restraint came under domestic pressure to act decisively. Within days, what had been a border incident became an air campaign. What had been an air campaign drew in ground forces. What had been a ground engagement began threatening infrastructure, energy pipelines, communication nodes, logistics corridors, whose disruption sent immediate signals to every external power with a stake in the region's stability. By the end of the first week of full hostilities, 3 separate back-channel communication lines had been activated between major powers. Emergency sessions were convened. The language being used in private diplomatic cables, later leaked, later confirmed, described the situation as approaching a threshold that cannot be walked back without immediate intervention. The ceasefire that would eventually be announced did not emerge from goodwill. It emerged from exhaustion, external pressure, and the cold strategic recognition by both sides that continued escalation carried risks they were not yet fully prepared to absorb. Negotiations were conducted across multiple capitals simultaneously. Mediating parties, including at least 2 regional powers and 1 Western government, shuttled between delegations in sessions that reportedly stretched through consecutive nights. The sticking points were numerous: prisoner exchanges, withdrawal distances, monitoring mechanisms, the question of who would verify compliance and what consequences would follow violation. After 11 days of negotiation, a framework was agreed upon: a 14-day ceasefire, renewable in theory upon mutual consent, a joint monitoring mechanism, a commitment to resume talks on a permanent settlement before the ceasefire window closed. When the announcement came, it was greeted with cautious relief by markets, by allied governments, and by populations in the conflict zone who had spent weeks in survival mode. That relief lasted exactly 14 days. Here is what the public record now shows clearly. The warning signs of collapse were present almost from the moment the ceasefire began. Intelligence assessments, since partially declassified or leaked to major outlets, indicated that at least one party had not fully stood down its forward-positioned assets during the ceasefire window. Satellite imagery showed continued logistical movement in areas that should have been static under the terms of the agreement. Intercepted communications suggested that senior military commanders on at least one side viewed the ceasefire not as a pause toward peace, but as a tactical breathing space before resuming operations with greater force. The monitoring mechanism, as agreed, was understaffed and under-resourced from day one. Verification reports that should have been filed daily were arriving irregularly. Complaints submitted through the joint framework were acknowledged but not acted upon within the agreed timelines. Diplomats knew, analysts knew, and yet the machinery of de-escalation moved too slowly or not at all. By day 12, the ceasefire was already a fiction maintained by the mutual interest of both sides in not being seen as the party that broke it first. By day 14, someone made a decision, and the fragile architecture of 14 days of quiet came apart in a single night. It began, as so many escalations do, with a single incident whose details remain fiercely contested. In the final hours of the 14th day, the last night of the agreed ceasefire window, something happened at a forward position along the conflict's most sensitive fault line. By dawn, both sides were issuing statements. By mid-morning, the joint monitoring mechanism had been formally suspended. By afternoon, the ceasefire was dead. What exactly triggered the collapse depends entirely on who you ask. And in a conflict this charged, with this many external actors watching and calculating, the question of who fired first is not merely historical. It is the justification for everything that comes next. The first party to issue a formal statement described an unprovoked military strike against one of its ceasefire-designated positions. According to their account, the attack was deliberate, coordinated, and could not have been the result of miscommunication or rogue action by a lower-level commander. They presented what they described as drone surveillance footage showing an organized movement of hostile forces toward their position in the hours before the incident. Evidence, they argued, of premeditated intent. Senior officials from this side held an emergency press conference within hours of the breakdown. Their language was measured but unambiguous. This was not an accident. This was not a provocation by a fringe element. This was, in their framing, a calculated decision by the opposing command structure to use the ceasefire as cover, to reposition, resupply, and then strike under the assumption that the international community's attention had relaxed. They announced that they considered the ceasefire fully and permanently void. They announced that their military had been placed on elevated operational readiness. And they announced that any further hostile action would be met with a response that would be, in their words, disproportionate by design. The opposing side's account was almost a mirror image, and that symmetry is itself revealing. Side B issued its own statement within the same news cycle, alleging that it was their position that had been struck first. Their narrative described a targeted attack on a logistics node that had been clearly registered with the monitoring mechanism as a protected site under the ceasefire terms. They produced their own imagery, intercepted communications, they claimed, proving that the opposing side had been planning a provocation to justify resuming hostilities before the ceasefire renewal deadline arrived. Their framing carried a specific political logic. By alleging that Side A had engineered the collapse, they positioned themselves as the aggrieved party, the side that came to the table in good faith and was betrayed. This framing was not accidental. It was designed to shape the international response, to preempt condemnation, and to establish a narrative of victimhood that would complicate any calls for symmetric accountability. Senior officials on this side made immediate contact with their external patron states. Within hours, supportive statements began arriving from allied capitals, carefully worded, calibrated to stop short of explicit endorsement of resumed hostilities, but unmistakably signaling that this side would not be abandoned. Here is the uncomfortable analytical reality. As of this moment, neither account has been independently verified. The drone footage presented by Side A has not been authenticated by any neutral third party. The intercepted communications cited by Side B have not been released in full. The Joint Monitoring Mechanism, the body that should have been the authoritative source on ceasefire compliance, issued a statement acknowledging that it had received reports of violations from both sides in the 72 hours preceding the collapse, but explicitly declined to assign primary responsibility pending a full investigation. That investigation, by the mechanism's own timeline, will take weeks, weeks that neither side appears willing to wait. Behind the public statements, a different conversation is happening in the intelligence channels of major powers. Western intelligence agencies, according to officials who spoke to multiple outlets on condition of anonymity, had been tracking indicators of an imminent ceasefire breakdown for at least 4 days before it occurred. Satellite imagery had flagged anomalous military movement. Signals intelligence had detected communication patterns inconsistent with a genuine stand-down. At least one allied government had quietly raised these concerns through diplomatic back channels and received assurances that were not kept. What remains deeply uncertain, and what is driving the urgency in Washington, Brussels, and other allied capitals right now, is whether the breakdown was the result of a deliberate strategic decision at the highest levels of command, or whether it was triggered by a field-level incident that then spiraled beyond the control of senior leadership on either side. The distinction matters enormously. A deliberate top-level decision to collapse the ceasefire implies a strategic readiness to escalate, a prepared next phase of operations, a calculated bet that resumed conflict serves long-term interests better than a negotiated pause. A field-level spiral, by contrast, implies that both command structures may still have an off-ramp available if the political will to use it can be found fast enough. Right now, the evidence points in both directions simultaneously, and that ambiguity, perhaps more than the collapse itself, is what is keeping analysts and senior officials awake tonight. To understand why the collapse of this ceasefire carries consequences far beyond the immediate conflict zone, you have to look at a map. Not the kind of map that appears in news broadcasts, color-coded territories, simplified front lines, clean borders. You have to look at the operational map, the strategic map, the one that military planners, energy executives, and alliance architects study in closed rooms when they are calculating what they can and cannot afford to lose. Because what sits at the center of this conflict is not simply disputed territory, it is a convergence of strategic assets whose combined significance makes this one of the most consequential geographic flashpoints on the planet. The conflict zone sits at the intersection of multiple overlapping military spheres of influence. Forward operating bases maintained by external powers in the broader region provide rapid deployment capability within striking distance of the front lines. Air defense systems, some supplied by Western nations, others by Russia or China, create overlapping coverage zones that complicate any unilateral military calculation. What makes the military geometry here uniquely dangerous is the presence of what analysts call entanglement infrastructure. These are assets, bases, personnel, equipment, advisory missions that belong not to the primary combatants but to their external patrons. When those assets come under threat, or when their operators are placed in harm's way, the conflict is no longer simply between the two parties on the ground. It becomes a direct confrontation between the powers behind them. At least two external powers currently have personnel embedded with forces on opposing sides of this conflict. The ceasefire, while it held, provided a buffer that prevented direct interaction between those personnel in a contested environment. With the ceasefire gone, that buffer is gone with it. Beyond the military architecture, the geography of this conflict commands attention for a second, equally critical reason. The region sits adjacent to, or in some cases directly astride, energy and logistics corridors of global importance. Oil and natural gas pipelines that supply significant portions of European and Asian energy markets pass through or near the conflict zone. Maritime routes critical to international shipping, including the movement of energy commodities, grain, and manufactured goods, are within the operational radius of the military assets now being repositioned following the ceasefire collapse. When conflict activity escalates in this corridor, the effects are not confined to the battlefield. They radiate outward through the global economic system with a speed and severity that policymakers are never fully prepared for, regardless of how many contingency plans exist on paper. Energy markets registered the ceasefire collapse within hours. The signals were immediate and unmistakable, and we will examine those consequences in full in a later section. There is a third layer of strategic importance that receives far less attention in mainstream coverage, but is regarded by military planners as potentially the most decisive factor in any resumed escalation. Critical infrastructure, power generation facilities, water treatment systems, communications networks, transportation hubs in and around the conflict zone represents both a military target set and a humanitarian tripwire. Strikes against this infrastructure, intentional or incidental, produce cascading effects that extend far beyond the immediate military objective. Previous phases of this conflict saw infrastructure targeting that drew sharp international condemnation. With the ceasefire now collapsed, and both sides having publicly committed to responses they described as disproportionate, the risk of infrastructure strikes and the humanitarian and geopolitical consequences that follow has increased dramatically. Intelligence assessments reviewed by senior officials at at least two Western capitals have specifically flagged infrastructure vulnerability as a primary escalation risk in the post-ceasefire environment. Perhaps the most dangerous strategic dimension of this collapse is the one that operates at the level of formal and informal alliance commitments. Both primary parties in this conflict have patron relationships with major powers that carry explicit or implicit security guarantees. Those guarantees were negotiated in a different strategic environment, one in which a localized conflict was the assumed scenario. What was not fully stress-tested in those frameworks was what happens when a localized conflict begins to threaten the credibility of the guaranteeing power's deterrence posture. That stress test is now underway. When a patron power has publicly committed to the security of a conflict party through arms transfers, advisory missions, public statements, or formal treaty obligations, a significant escalation by the opposing side creates an almost irresistible pressure to respond, not necessarily because the strategic logic demands it, but because the credibility of the deterrence guarantee depends on the perception that it will be honored. This is the mechanism through which regional conflicts become global ones. It is not a theory, it is a historical pattern repeated with grim consistency across the last century of geopolitical conflict. And right now, every element of that pattern is present and active in this situation. The ceasefire was not just a pause in fighting. It was a structural barrier between a contained regional conflict and an uncontained one. That barrier is now gone. And the strategic map, the real one, the one that keeps generals and foreign ministers awake at night, looks significantly more dangerous this morning than it did 14 days ago. When a ceasefire of this magnitude collapses, the public statements come fast, the political reactions come faster, but the analysis that actually matters, the kind that shapes decisions in the situation rooms and war cabinets of major powers, moves on a different timeline. It is slower, more methodical, and far more sobering than anything that appears in a breaking news headline. Over the past 48 hours, that analysis has begun to surface through think tank assessments, intelligence community signals, and the careful, calibrated statements of senior military analysts who choose their words with the precision of people who understand exactly what is at stake. A picture is emerging, and it is not a reassuring one. According to assessments circulating among Western intelligence services, portions of which have been shared with allied governments and selectively disclosed to major outlets, the ceasefire collapse was not a spontaneous event. The analytical consensus as it currently stands points toward a conclusion that at least one party entered the ceasefire period without genuine intention of honoring its full terms. The indicators cited in these assessments are specific and documented. Logistical resupply operations continued in forward areas throughout the ceasefire window, operations inconsistent with a genuine stand-down posture. Command and control communications between senior military leadership and forward units maintained an operational tempo that analysts describe as incompatible with a force that has genuinely stepped back from conflict readiness. Perhaps most significantly, intelligence analysts noted a pattern of strategic messaging in the days immediately preceding the collapse. Public statements, media placements, and diplomatic communications that appeared designed to preemptively establish a narrative of victimhood. In the analytical community, this kind of pre-positioned narrative construction is recognized as a consistent precursor to planned escalation. You build the story before you take the action. Officials familiar with these assessments, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the intelligence picture as strongly suggestive of premeditation on at least one side, though they were careful to note that definitive conclusions await further analysis. Beyond the intelligence community, the analytical response from major geopolitical research institutions has been swift and pointed. Analysts at leading international security institutes have focused particular attention on what they describe as the structural failure of the ceasefire's verification architecture. The monitoring mechanism, as designed, lacked the enforcement capacity to deter violations by a party determined to commit them. It was, in the assessment of several senior analysts, a framework built for good faith actors in a conflict populated by strategic actors, a fundamental mismatch that made collapse not merely possible but probable. One recurring theme in think tank analysis is the concept of the tactical ceasefire, an agreement entered into not as a genuine step toward resolution, but as a mechanism for achieving military objectives that active conflict was not delivering efficiently: resupply, repositioning, consolidation of territorial gains, rehabilitation of degraded units. In this analytical framework, the ceasefire was not a peace process. It was a pause in a war that one or both parties intended to resume on more favorable terms. Experts at conflict resolution institutes have pointed to a second structural problem: the absence of any meaningful political process running parallel to the military pause. A ceasefire without a political track, they argue, is not a step toward peace. It is a pressure valve that delays rather than resolves the underlying drivers of conflict. When it expires or collapses, those drivers are still present and often more entrenched than before. Former senior military officials and independent defense analysts have zeroed in on the operational implications of the collapse with particular urgency. The consensus among this community is that the post-ceasefire environment presents a significantly elevated risk of rapid, large-scale escalation, precisely because both sides use the ceasefire window to improve their military positions. Forces that were degraded at the start of the ceasefire have been partially reconstituted. Supply lines that were strained have been partially restored. Command structures that were disrupted have been partially reorganized. In plain terms, both sides enter the post-ceasefire phase in better military shape than they were in when the fighting stopped. That means resumed hostilities will likely be more intense, more sustained, and more difficult to halt than the conflict phase that preceded the ceasefire. Military analysts have also flagged a specific escalation risk that has received insufficient public attention: the potential for miscalculation involving external power assets. As repositioning operations resume and operational tempos increase, the probability of an incident involving personnel or equipment belonging to an external patron power increases in direct proportion. A single such incident, a strike, an interception, a collision, could trigger an escalation dynamic that the primary combatants themselves would be unable to control or reverse. At the policy and academic level, the conversation has shifted rapidly from ceasefire management to crisis prevention. Scholars of conflict escalation have drawn pointed comparisons to historical cases in which regional ceasefires collapsed and subsequently triggered broader confrontations, not because any single actor wanted a wider war, but because the structural conditions made escalation the path of least resistance for every party involved. Policy experts focused on great power competition have raised a more direct concern. In an environment where multiple nuclear-armed states have strategic stakes in the outcome of this conflict, the collapse of the ceasefire does not merely increase the risk of conventional escalation. It compresses the decision timelines available to senior leadership in patron states, forcing choices that under normal circumstances would benefit from weeks of deliberation into windows measured in hours. Compressed decision timelines operating under conditions of high uncertainty and high domestic political pressure are precisely the conditions under which historical miscalculations have occurred. The experts are not predicting catastrophe, but they are, with unusual unanimity, describing the current moment as one of the most dangerous inflection points in this conflict's trajectory, and one that demands immediate, serious, and sustained diplomatic engagement at the highest possible level. Whether that engagement is coming and whether it will arrive in time remains the defining question of the next 72 hours. But the other side has a point. In the rush of breaking developments, in the surge of intelligence assessments and think tank analyses and military analyst warnings, it is easy to fall into a single narrative, a clean story with clear villains and obvious conclusions. And in geopolitics, particularly in conflicts as layered and as politically charged as this one, clean stories are almost always incomplete stories. So before we follow the escalation trajectory to its potential endpoints, intellectual honesty demands that we stop, that we apply the same analytical rigor to the alternative interpretation, that we ask the harder question: what if the dominant narrative is wrong, or at least significantly incomplete? The intelligence community assessment pointing toward premeditated ceasefire violation by at least one party is serious, but it is not conclusive. And the history of intelligence analysis in active conflict zones is, to put it diplomatically, a history of confident assessments that subsequent events revealed to be built on incomplete or misread information. Logistical movement during a ceasefire window is not by itself evidence of intent to violate. Armies do not freeze in place during ceasefires. They maintain readiness, they repair equipment, they rotate personnel, they move supplies, because a force that allows itself to become fully static during a ceasefire becomes vulnerable the moment that ceasefire ends, regardless of whether it ends by agreement or by collapse. What intelligence analysts characterized as indicators of premeditated violation may, in an alternative reading, reflect nothing more than standard operational maintenance by a military command that had legitimate reasons to distrust the opposing side's compliance. The narrative construction argument, the prepositioning of victimhood narratives before the collapse, is similarly ambiguous. Both sides engaged in this behavior. Both sides, in the days preceding the breakdown, made public statements and diplomatic placements that positioned them as the aggrieved party. If prepositioned narrative construction is evidence of planned provocation, then both sides are equally implicated, which means it may be evidence of mutual distrust rather than unilateral premeditation. There is a second alternative interpretation that deserves serious analytical attention, one that intelligence officials themselves have not fully ruled out. The miscalculation hypothesis holds that the ceasefire did not collapse because either side's senior leadership made a deliberate strategic decision to end it. It collapsed because a field-level incident triggered by the hair-trigger operational posture that both sides maintained throughout the ceasefire window produced casualties or perceived violations that created irresistible pressure for response at the command level faster than diplomatic channels could absorb or manage. This hypothesis is not comfortable. In some ways, it is more alarming than the premeditation narrative, because a deliberate strategic decision implies a degree of control and calculation that an accidental spiral does not. If senior leadership on either side chose to collapse the ceasefire, they can, in theory, choose to rebuild it. If the collapse was driven by a field-level incident that cascaded beyond anyone's control, the path back to de-escalation is significantly less clear. Conflict scholars point to historical precedents with uncomfortable regularity. Some of the most catastrophic military escalations of the modern era began not with orders from the top, but with incidents at the bottom, incidents that created political and military momentum that leaders found themselves unable or unwilling to reverse. There is a third alternative interpretation that receives almost no attention in mainstream coverage, and that omission is itself worth examining. The focus of most analysis has been on the two primary combatants, but this conflict does not exist in a bilateral vacuum. It exists within a dense web of external interests, external actors, and external operations, some of which have motivations that are entirely independent of and potentially contrary to the interests of the primary parties themselves. External actors with a strategic interest in preventing a negotiated settlement, because a settlement would consolidate an outcome unfavorable to their regional position, had concrete incentives to destabilize the ceasefire. Proxy networks, intelligence operations, and information campaigns capable of triggering or amplifying a field-level incident exist on multiple sides of this conflict. The possibility that the ceasefire was not broken by either primary party but was deliberately destabilized by an external actor seeking to reignite hostilities cannot be dismissed on the available evidence. This interpretation does not absolve either primary party of responsibility for the escalation that followed, but it does complicate the assignment of blame. And it raises a question that diplomatic frameworks built around bilateral negotiations are structurally ill-equipped to answer. What do you do when the spoiler is not at the table? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is the argument that focuses not on what either combatant did wrong, but on what the international community failed to do right. The ceasefire framework, as multiple analysts have now noted, was structurally inadequate from the moment it was signed. Inadequate verification, inadequate enforcement, inadequate political process running parallel to the military pause. These were not hidden flaws discovered after the fact. They were identified by conflict resolution experts at the time of the agreement's announcement, and they were overridden by the political pressure to declare a win, to present a ceasefire as progress, regardless of whether the architecture supporting it was genuinely capable of holding. In this reading, the collapse is not primarily a story of bad faith by one or both combatants. It is a story of diplomatic negligence by the international community, of powerful nations more interested in the optics of peacemaking than in the substance of it, of monitoring mechanisms designed to provide cover rather than accountability, of a process that was always more likely to delay escalation than to prevent it. If that argument is correct, and the structural evidence strongly supports it, then the lesson of this ceasefire collapse is not simply that one side cheated. It is that the international community built a house of cards and then expressed surprise when it fell. That is a harder truth. It implicates more actors, it demands more accountability, and it points toward a more difficult but more honest path forward. The ceasefire collapse happened in a specific place, but its consequences are not staying there. Within hours of the breakdown becoming public, the effects were already moving through the interconnected systems of the global economy, the international security architecture, and the political calculations of governments on every continent. What began as a bilateral military failure is now a global event, one whose reverberations will reach into the daily lives of ordinary people far removed from the conflict zone, in ways that are already measurable and in ways that are still unfolding. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told with sufficient clarity. The gap between a geopolitical event and its human consequences is almost always larger than it appears in the moment, and almost always closes faster than anyone expects. Energy markets responded to the ceasefire collapse with immediate and significant volatility. Oil prices surged within the first trading session following the breakdown announcement. The move was not purely speculative, it reflected a concrete reassessment of supply risk in a region whose energy infrastructure sits directly within the operational radius of the military assets now being repositioned. Traders and commodity analysts do not wait for bombs to fall before pricing in risk. They price it the moment the probability distribution shifts. And the probability distribution shifted dramatically overnight. If sustained military operations resume at scale, particularly if they involve strikes on energy infrastructure, which both sides have demonstrated willingness to conduct in previous conflict phases, the supply disruption risk to global oil and gas markets becomes not merely theoretical, but operational. Analysts at major energy research institutions have already revised their price forecasts upward. The range of outcomes they are now modeling includes scenarios that would push energy prices to levels not seen since the most acute supply crises of the past 2 decades. For American households, the transmission mechanism is direct and familiar. Higher oil prices mean higher gasoline prices. Higher gasoline prices mean higher transportation costs across the entire supply chain. Higher transportation costs mean higher prices for groceries, manufactured goods, and services, precisely at a moment when inflation pressures were only beginning to ease after years of post-pandemic economic stress. The Federal Reserve, which had been navigating a delicate path toward monetary policy normalization, now faces a renewed external shock that complicates every calculation it was making about interest rates, growth projections, and financial stability. Markets that had been pricing in a relatively benign economic trajectory are now repricing. The volatility visible in equity markets in the hours following the breakdown is not noise. It is the sound of institutional investors revising their models in real time. Beyond the economic dimension, the security consequences of the ceasefire collapse are already producing concrete military responses among major powers. Allied nations with forward-deployed assets in the broader region have quietly elevated their operational readiness postures. Naval assets have been repositioned. Air defense systems have been placed on heightened alert status. Contingency plans that existed on paper are being reviewed and updated by military staffs operating on compressed timelines. The United States military, with its extensive presence across the region, faces immediate and complex decisions about force protection, rules of engagement, and the management of the entanglement risk that we examined in the previous section. Every American service member operating in proximity to this conflict zone is now operating in a higher threat environment than they were 48 hours ago, not because they are direct targets, but because the compressed operational space and elevated military tempo increase the probability of incidents that were previously unlikely. NATO allies are facing their own set of pressures. The alliance's eastern members, those with the most direct exposure to the broader security environment in which this conflict is embedded, have already begun consultations about what the ceasefire collapse means for their own defense postures. Emergency consultations at the ambassadorial level have been reported. A formal emergency session of the North Atlantic Council has not yet been called, but multiple officials have indicated that one is being actively considered. At the level of great power competition, the ceasefire collapse is accelerating dynamics that were already in motion and creating new pressure points that none of the major players had fully prepared for. For the United States, the collapse represents a significant diplomatic setback, one that will invite scrutiny of the administration's regional strategy and its ability to translate diplomatic investment into durable outcomes. The political pressure to respond visibly and forcefully will be intense, and it will compete directly with the strategic imperative to avoid actions that further compress the escalation timeline. For Russia, the ceasefire collapse creates both opportunity and risk. Opportunity, because a resumed conflict diverts Western attention and resources from other theaters where Russian interests are directly engaged. Risk, because the unpredictability of a collapsed ceasefire environment extends to Russian assets and relationships in the region, and because an escalation that spins beyond anyone's control serves no one's strategic interests, including Moscow's. For China, the calculation is characteristically long-term. Beijing has positioned itself as a constructive diplomatic actor in this conflict, a positioning that serves its broader narrative of responsible global leadership as an alternative to Western-dominated international order. A ceasefire collapse that occurs despite or following Chinese diplomatic engagement is an uncomfortable development, but a prolonged conflict that exhausts Western diplomatic and military resources while elevating energy price volatility, which China has significant capacity to manage, may ultimately serve Beijing's strategic position better than a swift resolution would. Behind the market movements and the strategic calculations, there is a dimension of this story that no analytical framework fully captures, but that demands acknowledgement. The people living in and around the conflict zone who experienced 14 days of relative quiet are now facing the return of active hostilities. Families who had begun to move back towards some semblance of normal life are once again in survival mode. Humanitarian organizations that had used the ceasefire window to position supplies and personnel for relief operations are now reassessing their safety protocols and access routes. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has already issued a preliminary alert flagging the acute vulnerability of civilian populations in the conflict zone following the ceasefire breakdown. Aid corridors that were negotiated as part of the ceasefire framework are now of uncertain status. Medical facilities that were operating under the assumption of continued quiet are now preparing for mass casualty scenarios. For viewers watching this from the comfort and safety of distance in American cities, in European capitals, in the relatively stable regions of the world, the connection between this conflict and your daily life may feel abstract. It is not. The energy you use to heat your home, the food on your grocery shelf, the interest rate on your mortgage, the security environment in which your country operates, all of these are connected through systems that are more fragile and more interdependent than most people recognize in ordinary times to what happens in the next 72 hours in a conflict zone that may feel very far away. Geopolitics has never respected distance, and in a world this interconnected, it never will. We have traced this crisis from its origins to its collapse. We have examined the competing narratives, the strategic architecture, the intelligence assessments, the global consequences. Now we arrive at the question that every analyst, every diplomat, and every senior official in every relevant capital is asking in real time: what happens next? The honest answer is that nobody knows with certainty, but the framework of what is possible and what is probable can be mapped with analytical precision. And that map right now presents two sharply divergent paths forward. One leads toward a managed, difficult, but ultimately contained outcome. The other leads somewhere that no serious analyst wants to follow to its logical conclusion. Before we examine those paths, it is worth anchoring this analysis in what the available record has confirmed beyond reasonable dispute. A 14-day ceasefire brokered through intensive multilateral diplomacy has collapsed. Both primary parties have declared the agreement void and have placed their military forces on elevated operational readiness. The joint monitoring mechanism has been suspended. Diplomatic back channels that were active during the ceasefire negotiation period have gone quiet or are operating at significantly reduced intensity. External patron powers have been notified and are actively consulting with their respective client parties. Major power governments have issued carefully worded statements, none of which have called for an immediate return to ceasefire, and several of which have included language that, read carefully, provides political cover for resumed military operations by the party they support. Energy markets have registered the collapse with immediate price movements. Allied military forces in the broader region have elevated their readiness postures. Humanitarian organizations have issued alerts about civilian vulnerability, and the international community's attention, fragmented across multiple simultaneous crises, as it always is now being forced to focus on a situation that is moving faster than the diplomatic machinery designed to manage it. What remains unconfirmed is the question of who bears primary responsibility for the breakdown and whether the collapse was the result of deliberate strategic decision, field-level miscalculation, or external destabilization. That question will be debated for years. In the immediate term, it matters less than what happens in the next 72 hours. The critical unknowns are specific and consequential. We do not yet know whether direct communication lines between senior military commanders on both sides remain open. The existence of such lines, however adversarial the relationship, provides a critical mechanism for preventing accidental escalation from becoming intentional escalation. Their absence would represent a serious and immediate danger. We do not yet know whether any mediating party has been able to establish contact with both sides simultaneously following the collapse. The shuttle diplomacy that produced the original ceasefire required 11 days of intensive engagement. Whether the political will and the diplomatic bandwidth exist to restart that process under conditions significantly more hostile than those that preceded the first negotiation is deeply uncertain. We do not yet know the full scope of military repositioning that has occurred since the breakdown. Satellite imagery assessments are ongoing. Intelligence analysis is being updated in real time. But the operational picture is incomplete, and in warfare, incomplete pictures produce dangerous miscalculations. And we do not yet know whether either side's senior leadership has fully decided on its next military objective. The rhetoric of disproportionate response and elevated readiness may be posturing designed to create negotiating leverage, or it may be the honest declaration of intent by commands that have already issued their orders. In the coming hours and days, several specific developments will serve as reliable indicators of which trajectory this crisis is following. Watch the diplomatic channels. If a major power, particularly one with credible relationships on both sides of this conflict, publicly announces a mediation initiative within the next 48 hours, that is a signal that the international community has assessed the situation as retrievable and is committing resources to retrieve it. If the diplomatic response remains limited to statements of concern and calls for restraint without a concrete mediation framework, that is a signal that no one has calculated that a solution is within reach and that the default path is escalation. Watch the military movements. Defensive repositioning, forces moving back from forward positions, air defense systems being activated, naval assets moving to protective postures is consistent with elevated readiness without offensive intent. Offensive repositioning, forces moving toward contact lines, strike packages being assembled, logistics chains being activated for sustained operations is a different signal entirely. The distinction between the two, visible in satellite imagery and signals intelligence, will tell analysts more about the trajectory of this crisis than any public statement. Watch the energy markets. Sustained price increases above the initial shock movement will indicate that commodity traders have assessed resumed large-scale conflict as the baseline scenario. A stabilization or partial reversal of the initial price movement will indicate that markets have assessed the breakdown as a manageable disruption rather than the opening of a new, more intense conflict phase. And watch the statements from Beijing. China's public positioning in the next 48 hours will be one of the most reliable indicators of whether a diplomatic off-ramp is being constructed behind the scenes. When China speaks carefully and constructively in a crisis of this kind, it is often because it is simultaneously engaged in private diplomacy that it does not want to compromise with premature public disclosure. Silence or vague formulations, by contrast, may indicate that Beijing has assessed the situation as beyond near-term diplomatic resolution and is positioning itself accordingly. The first forward scenario is difficult but not impossible. In this scenario, the immediate post-collapse period of elevated rhetoric and military repositioning does not produce a significant kinetic incident in the first 72 hours. The absence of a major incident provides enough space for a mediating party, most likely one with credible relationships on both sides, to establish contact and propose an emergency framework. That framework does not attempt to resurrect the collapsed ceasefire in its original form. Instead, it proposes a more limited, more verifiable, more honestly monitored pause, one that acknowledges the structural failures of the previous agreement and builds in mechanisms designed to address them. This scenario requires political will on both sides that is not currently visible in their public postures. It requires a mediating party with sufficient leverage to make both sides' continued escalation more costly than a return to negotiation. And it requires the international community to move with the speed and seriousness of purpose that its recent performance on this crisis does not fully inspire confidence in. It is possible. It is not probable, not without a significant shift in the conditions currently visible on the ground. The second forward scenario is the one that keeps analysts awake. In this scenario, the elevated military postures on both sides produce an incident, deliberate or accidental. It ultimately does not matter within the first 72 to 96 hours. That incident produces casualties. Those casualties produce a response. That response crosses a threshold, geographic, operational, or in terms of the assets targeted, that one or more external patron powers cannot absorb without acting on their commitment to their client party. Once external patron forces are directly engaged, even in a limited defensive or retaliatory capacity, the conflict is no longer a regional one. It is a confrontation between the powers behind the combatants and confrontations between major powers, particularly in an environment where nuclear deterrence is part of the strategic calculus, operate under a set of dynamics that conventional conflict management frameworks are not designed to handle. This scenario does not require anyone to want a world war. It requires only that each actor, responding rationally to the incentives and pressures in front of them, takes the next logical step until the cumulative effect of those individually rational steps produces an outcome that no single actor chose and that no single actor can reverse. That is not a theoretical construct. That is a description of how the worst conflicts in modern history began. Here is where the analysis lands. The collapse of this ceasefire is not by itself a world-ending event. Ceasefires collapse, negotiations fail, conflicts resume. The international system has absorbed these shocks before and found paths forward that stopped short of the worst outcomes. But this collapse is happening in a specific context, a context defined by great power competition at its most acute, by alliance commitments under maximum stress, by compressed decision timelines, by a diplomatic community that has already demonstrated the limits of its capacity to manage this conflict, and by military forces on multiple sides that are better rested, better supplied, and better positioned than they were before the ceasefire began. The window for preventing the worst outcome is real, it is open, but it is not wide and it is not staying open indefinitely. What happens in the next 72 hours will tell us whether the leaders, diplomats, and institutions responsible for managing this crisis are equal to this moment. History is watching. And so are we. If this analysis has given you a clearer picture of what is happening and why it matters, subscribe to this channel right now, hit the notification bell, because this story is not over. It is in every meaningful sense just beginning, and when the next development breaks, and it will break soon, you will want to be here when it does. Stay informed, stay engaged. The world needs people who are paying attention.